This is Planet Rilgar, home to Blackwater City, great mob enemies, enemy encounters, setups, hoverboard racing, a daring rising water escape level, and some of the most adorable shoebox cityscapes of the entire 6th console generation. On the surface, Planet Rilgar is just a standout level in an exceptional PlayStation 2 mascot action platformer. But a closer inspection can shed a light on the design principles employed to craft not just an exceptional level, but an outstanding world. Because if you let it, Ratchet Clank 1 can teach you a lot about game design. Conventional architecture is a fractured field in many ways, with multiple irreconcilable approaches to design. Do you start from the inside and build the house around the space the people live in, or do you design the house from the outside and then conform the living space to the sense you want to impart through design? Is it a holistic design where everything down to the furniture is marked by a uniting style, or should the space invite the occupant to impart their own identity on it? Video game architecture is, thankfully for us, a lot simpler. You really just need to ask, what does the player do, and how can the space best facilitate the player doing what the player does? These two questions can take you to the finish line when level designing, but when I do it, I have 4 questions on my mind at all times. Number 1 is, how can I make the locks on progress interesting? Number 2 is, how can I make the environment tell a compelling story? Number 3 is, how can I make the environment look good? And number 4 is, how can I make the level play good? For number 1, I should define locks on progress. This is anything which impedes progress through the level, be it a closed gate, which the player needs to get a key to open, a big cliff, which the player needs to work their way around, or an arena full of difficult enemies which the player must defeat to move further. If you want to be a bit more abstract, however, every collision object and every single component of a level is technically gating off content. You can only stand on one spot at a given time, so the fact that we have a movement scheme which allows us to get from A to B to C means progress locks are hard-coded into the core mechanics. If your game is about moving around and fighting, expect mobility and enemy encounters to be where progress locks are most plentiful. Ratchet Clank 1 is mainly about mobility and combat, so the actual locks on progress don't need much explaining to the layman. If you've played a few video games, you should be familiar with the setup. What is worth bringing up when looking at Ratchet Clank compared to other games, however, because this has significant ramifications for the level design, is Rack's devotion to early 2000s excess. The combat is much more explosive than what you'd find in any other game of the genre, and the platforming challenges have a real action hero heft to them, as well as a zany presentation. Spyro can glide using his own wings, but Ratchet needs to get Clank a helicopter upgrade to accomplish the same feat. But for the opening of the game, things are, relative to the late game, subdued. Ratchet has some innate acrobatics, and he's equipped with the Bomb Glove. I used to have a hard time wrapping my mind around why the Bomb Glove was the starter weapon and not something like the Blaster, considering the skill floor for the Blaster is much lower, but I think this choice actually makes a certain amount of sense. Lesson 1. First impressions matter. It's not as user-friendly, but if you want to hammer home the game's identity, a weapon with more visual bombast is probably a better choice. If we look at the marketing for the game, we should be able to get a good idea for what feeling the creators wanted to attach Ratchet to, and what the design philosophy was. They chose cool. Ratchet is cool, so you must be cool if you play the game. Which is true. And we see this in the trailers with the explosively large arsenal, the breakable boxes, the dynamic platforming challenges, etc. As for the design philosophy, it's eyebrow-raising Banjo-Kazooie antics mixed with the rip and tear from Doom. And here's why the Bomb Glove is the superior starter weapon, in spite of its higher skill floor, than something like the Blaster. Because it brings out the best of the combat. We don't have sideways strafing yet, or an aiming reticule fixed to the camera. Again, yet. So we're relying on the game's auto-aim to help us, which means Rack's combat is less about getting the camera to align properly and more about having Ratchet himself face the correct direction. This sounds like a not so great system, but there's a final piece to this which brings it all home. Platforming. Rack excels primarily because it's an action platformer. The first enemies in the game are the little grunt frogs, nothing special, but the second ones are these robots which create an area hazard which we must navigate around to deal damage, because the line of electricity they generate is just a bit longer than the range of our bombs. Yes, what made Ratchet different from the other mascot platformers above all else, I'd argue, is the tight integration of the platforming into the combat. Jak was cool, but platforming and combat were very distinct modes of playing. Sly was also cool, but if you ever actually got into a straight-up fight with a gang of enemies there, you probably screwed up. In those games, you can sneak attack, which is where the dynamic platforming challenge was best integrated into the combat. But Sly is stealth, Ratchet is not. So any generic enemy encounter in this game is probably gonna look way cooler than what the competition could offer. Of course, it would all collapse in on itself if not for the wrench. Lesson 2, try to not leave the player without options. At all times, Ratchet is equipped with a wrench and it's an endlessly usable melee weapon. Enemies are best disposed of from a distance, so the wrench is a weapon of last resort, mostly, and its existence ensures that players can stay in the fight even if they run out of ammo. Touches like this one are why you thank your QA testers, people. In combat, you never want to be made dependent on the wrench, but having it means you always have a chance to win out. Of course, you'll mostly just use it to break crates. Planet Veldin concludes with a natural evolution from encountering the first electricity-projecting robots, where we encounter more and more of them who retreat from Ratchet until they're in a group. I'm not counting gradual challenge increase as a lesson that feels a bit too obvious to me. For locks on progress, however, Ratchet & Clank has something to teach. Lesson 3. When locking content, get creative. Planet Veldin is the most basic level in the game, because we have the fewest mobility options at our disposal. So obstacles here are cliffs, walls, and enemies. On planet Novalis, however, things get a bit more expansive with the introduction of water. There's a completely optional path near the start which teaches us to swim, there's the path to the plumber, and then there's the river separating the early half of Lower Novalis and the later half of Lower Novalis. For the mandatory paths of the level, water acts as a barrier to be gotten around, but it's also a harsher failure state than what we saw on Veldin. If you fell off the cliffs there, you died and had to retry the area. If you fall into the water here, you don't have the jump height to make it back up, so you have to backtrack and retry the area. Dying is harsh, but having your time wasted is usually harsher. In video games, at least. I think that the first post-tutorial planet being such a lush and watery place works well to establish the game's cynical, satirical tone. Ratchet grew up on a dusty, mountainous planet, and in a lesser game, this is the point in the story where he sees the majesty of the world he never knew. Here, that expectation is turned on its head because everyone who is here, in what to Ratchet might look like a paradise, is trying to leave. Best exemplified, of course, by the plumber who rants about socio-economic disparity. Lesson 4. Don't hate your characters. So, I didn't plan on covering much of the story in this video, but hear me out. The game lays the satirical, cynical tone on thick. At this point, Clank is still very naive, but nothing to come will serve to reinforce that. Take the infobots to the next planets. Both feature in-universe celebrities, and both of those planets will have the NPC meetings be very disappointing. Things aren't at all interesting in the lives of the people here when the cameras aren't rolling, but all throughout, Clank remains an optimist. I don't generally like cynicism in media, but I think the reason it lands in this game is because cynicism and earnestness are at the heart of our duo's relationship. Ratchet knocks Clank for wearing his heart on his sleeve, but the game doesn't make that the joke. In fact, in the end, it's Clank's earnestness which wins over Ratchet. The final thing I want to talk about before leaving Novalis is Lesson 5, don't fight the controller. I'll have more to say about swimming later, but I think it's an example of game design being liberated by the controller. The precision offered by a pair of joysticks, each one having a 360-degree range of movement, simply blows away anything directional keys could have offered. See also the little walkway before reaching the plumber. They would have never been able to put something that focused in a PlayStation 1 Spyro. The input device limits design every bit as much as the processing power of the hardware or the display resolution of the monitor. And unless that's explicitly the point, you don't want the player screwing up because you refused to meet the controller on its terms. Okay, that's actually different. I wanted to make combat independent of the player's facing direction. Forget it. Don't fight the controller. The progression layout of the game forks around this point, with the player being able to go to either Aridia or Curven. Of course, Curven has an item in it required to obtain a mandatory item in Aridia, and Aridia does not have any item needed to overcome a lock-on progress on Curven, so economically Curven is the right planet to tackle first. Lesson 6. Make standardization your friend whenever you can. Planet Curven has the same building blocks to the challenges as Novalis and Velden did. Grunt enemies which try to come at you to deal damage, and ranged enemies who are immobile while shooting and whose shots act as environmental hazards to be overcome with creative use of the platforming mechanics. The Helipack upgrade changes the parameters for level design moving forwards because the player can cross longer gaps. This is fairly obvious, but I'm saying this to all the would-be game designers out there. Know the parameters of your systems and standardize the challenges early, and you won't have to remake half of your game every 3 months. If you want an example of how enemy parameters influence the design of Rack 1, sit down, cause I'm gonna blow your mind. Enemies tend to not follow you over gaps, and you can count on one hand how many times you're fighting on sloped terrain. There's very few instances of a level being about ascending a steep height. Most areas are fairly flat because flat terrains congeal best with the combat mechanics. This is something which the series sadly never got around to fixing, because I think the tower ascent areas we do get in Ratchet are some of the best moments, like the Ascent of the Plumber on Novalis or the Fitness Course Tower here on Curven. Note in both cases though that we aren't ascending slopes here, we are moving up flat platforms. Planet Aridia is actually a really good example of this. If you look really hard through the game, you might find some exception to this rule, an area where we are fighting enemies on a steep slope. I don't count the flying enemies, so please don't comment about those, but at least 95% of encounters are not that. As for why, I'm not sure. Maybe their pathfinding isn't great on slopes, maybe our auto-aim isn't great, maybe the different elevations are actually used to mark which AIs should and should not be active. So the plane Ratchet is standing on is where enemies should be active, but everywhere else the game can dump the AI to lighten the processing load. Just spitballing some ideas here, I really don't know why there's not a lot of sloped combat and why enemies don't move between elevation, but this setup is standardized throughout the whole game, so it's probably a workaround to some issue Insomniac games encountered when testing other ways of designing. Make standardization your friend whenever you can. Every enemy in Ratchet, with a few exceptions, is either a fast-moving grunt who comes towards the player to do damage, or a ranged enemy who is mostly stationary but creates environmental hazards. Those are the kinds of enemies which congeal best with the platforming combat system because both force the player to move around. Knowing these parameters, enemies can be designed to best take advantage of them, and level design might be eased up because both types of enemies simply need space for them and Ratchet to operate in to play well. Ratchet has excellent level design, partly because of enemy standardization, not in spite of it. Lesson 7. Parse out the tutorial. This is Game Design 101, but it doesn't hurt to talk about it. If the first area in your game requires the player to learn literally every mechanic they'll be using, your game better be simple or you're gonna lose some people. Planet Curven is the third or fourth, depending on how you play, level in the game, and this is where the tutorial section of Rack 1 ends. Every core mobility mechanic of the game must be understood to proceed from here. The fitness course makes use of every basic mobility option and ends with Ratchet getting the slingshot so he can Spider-Man around. The train section of the level ensures the player has used every kind of jump the Helipack, the best gadget in the game, has to offer. Because this thing lets us stay airborne for longer and travel further while in the air, you might expect more gaps to appear in the levels, but we really don't get that many. There are certainly segments in the game to follow which would be undoable without the Helipack, but for the most part areas aren't all that broken up. And I think that's because it might undermine the action platforming since enemies can't chase us across those gaps. The helipack doesn't see a whole lot of play in combat, but it's still a great inclusion. Ratchet is faster with it and we have more options. And recovery. Just like how the wrench gives us an option in combat when we run out of ammo, the helipack gives us options in platforming when we miss a jump, in the reduced fall speed, and the more impactful mid-air controls. So yeah, Game Design 101, parse out the tutorial. Before moving on from Planet Curvin, I should do justice to the Ratchet remake and acknowledge that its take on the train section is vastly superior to the originals. For the purpose of this video, I think it helps to break the levels up into 3 groups. The tutorial levels, the mid-game, and the endgame. Because the sensibilities for level design and skill expectations are noticeably different for these 3 groups. I've gone through the tutorial levels, and the current batch will reach from Eudora to Battalia. And Eudora, I'd say, is one of the game's better levels, even though it starts and finishes without much fanfare. It doesn't exactly blow your mind, but I think the way it forces you to turn the bolt cranks to unlock the bridges is a nice way to lock off content, and I think the theming is among the best in the game. Novalis was a planet under attack, Aridia was a desert which was being stripped for resources, Curvin was a bustling metropolis, Eudora is a logging site. The enemies here mostly aren't designed to be soldiers, they're here to cut down trees. I think the reason Eudora has such little fanfare is because the only NPC encounter is against a boss who runs away when we approach him without any dialogue, so whereas most planets have a point of view character to give us a sense for the culture and place in question, Eudora doesn't. For weapons, Eudora is an interesting bag of worms. Lesson 8. Play to your strengths. So, in Ratchet & Clank, weapon purchases unlock as you unlock more planets. On Novalis, we first unlocked the ability to buy the flamethrower, which spawns a hitbox right in front of Ratchet, making it arguably the best weapon in the game, other than the Rhino. Might be better if we're taking placement and affordability into account. It also deals decent damage, and it's the best box breaker for most of the game. Eudora's weapons are the Glove of Doom and the Suck Cannon, and I feel the former is as terrible as the latter is brilliant. The Glove of Doom spawns little gremlins to attack the enemies for you, and the Suck Cannon lets you vacuum up small enemies and then reuse them as ammo. The problem I have with the former is that it trivializes the integration of platforming into the combat. What I love about the latter is that, with the exception of an even goofier weapon we'll talk about later on, this is probably the combat philosophy of the game taken to its most extreme. The Suck Cannon is one of the hardest weapons to master because it doesn't natively have any ammo. You need to acquire it, and that requires you to get into the thick of things near the grunt enemies who do well in close proximity. Then, when you have ammo in it, after sucking the little guys up, you have to be pretty accurate when you use it because you might not know when the next time you get ammo for it might be. I've talked about the standardized system for enemy encounters in the game, and the Suck Cannon only works because of this. Every area needs to give the player some amount of grunt enemies for the Suck Cannon to be viable when fighting, or it must make the challenge something other than fighting. This weapon is a great example of what you can do when the rules governing your game are tightly standardized. Play to your strengths. Lesson 9. Quiet time. G34 Station, the next area, is the biggest shakeup in the core gameplay in this batch. It introduces the first Clank section, where we get the Hydro Displacer. It has the first timed challenge, and it's where we get the grind boots. The Clank section is quiet time, that magical moment where a work shuts up for a moment and lets you breathe. Sure, there's still combat, but it's a lot less hectic. I wouldn't want a game comprising solely of Clank sections with as little going on as the ones here have, but as momentary breaks from the louder Ratchet sections, this is quite nice. Also, the gadgetbots make sense for Clank, so I won't knock them here. Clank's section is puzzle focused, which brings me to lesson number 10, players like to feel smart, let them. But the puzzle level isn't actually the best example of this lesson in the level. I was talking about quiet time, so of course The example I'm using here is the Taunter, a weapon which creates a loud noise which can break crates and aggro enemies towards you. It has less utility overall than something like the Suck Cannon, but it's one of the weapons you will want to toy around with in your 5th or so playthrough when you want to squeeze out that extra challenge. Figuring out how to lure enemies together into a trap is always fun, and that's facilitated of course by what I've talked about already with the standardization of enemy behaviors. Even here, we're fighting either close proximity melee enemies or ranged enemies, whose attacks create environmental hazards for us to navigate around. Planet Rilkar is probably the planet which embodies this let the player feel smart philosophy the best. It doesn't alter the parameters for enemies, it simply asks why the grunts, amoeboids in this case, and the ranged enemies, exterminators, can't fight one another. A lot of the sequences are set up to enable them to do just that, and just getting out of their way can make you feel pretty clever. The amoeboids also have this gimmick where they can separate into smaller amoeboids when they're hit, up to 3 times, and if you want to use the exterminators for crowd control, this is a variable you can play around with in your head zone. Call that lesson number 11, Dynamism. Rilkar starts with Ratchet and Clank located just outside of Blackwater City with 2 separate paths for entry. One is through the city itself, and the core dynamic element there is what we just talked about, which ends with us reaching the hoverboard race after talking to that lady whose breasts expand if we do side flips near her. But the other path takes our duo through the sewers, where the dynamic component is the water elevation. We use the hydro displacer to flood or drain an area. This is a fun concept, and it's done with the water just being a flat sheet, which I think is literally pulled up and down, with probably an invisible box or something which denotes which moveset should be active for the player when they're inside of it, and that box altering the moveset when the hydro displacer flips its governing variable. The conclusion to this path is an escape level where the water level gradually rises, culminating in our heroes meeting with Captain Quark, who gives them their heading to go to planet Umbris, the game's ultimate platforming level. Lesson 12. Good and Bad Difficulty. There are a few noticeable difficulty spikes in this game. The first one was Nebula G34, there's this planet, there's Orxen, the Ultanis levels, and finally Endgame Velden. If I had to find a singular shared characteristic in these levels, explaining why they are harder, I'd say they all have fewer arenas and more connective tissue, or tight funnel areas. There's always fewer combat options at our disposal in areas like that. Interestingly though, Umbris does not have any conventional enemy encounter. The closest thing to a normal enemy here are the giant carnivorous fish. Lesson 13. Please don't use invisible walls. The fish exist in other levels to close off the map boundaries when the map has an ocean. Ratchet has a few seconds of safety in the water, but eventually one of these will kill him to ensure the player doesn't exit the map. On Umbris, they swim in pools we can drain with the hydro displacer, and while killing them is mandatory because the water needs to be raised again to advance, they mostly just flop around in the shallows. Side note, it feels very good to kill these guys. The other obstacles here are turrets, bomb-throwing machines, and mines, which, interestingly enough, can all be neatly sorted into the enemy groups we've talked about already. Lesson 14. Save it for the sequel. Every area in Rack 1, which is more platforming than action, underscores what I consider to be the game's biggest weakness, and that's that momentum doesn't matter. There's a real thrill in something like a Mario 64 to bounce around the level super efficiently, but in Ratchet, outside of speedrunning, the tempo is much more geared around combat, and momentum you build up in one action doesn't flow very naturally to another one. Even when it comes to those speedrunning strats, this remains true. The most obvious example is the neutral long jump. That's where you use the helipack to fly forwards, and by timing the second long jump right when you land after releasing the stick, you can add more and more speed. If you ever alter the action you're about to perform, you'll reset Ratchet's momentum and you'll have to build up speed again. In an average platformer, momentum is hard to actually do well because it changes what the levels need to facilitate, and in the case of Ratchet, it might be unworkable considering the focus on combat. Without some really advanced auto-aim, using guns while bouncing around the map would probably just not work. But I think there's a way of integrating combat and platforming here, and it's not with the guns, but with the wrench. So if Ratchet's speed worked as a sort of wrench damage multiplier, and using the wrench would not ground momentum to a halt, I could see high-level play hone in on gaining and maintaining momentum while using the wrench to tear enemies to pieces. Probably the wrench hitbox would need to be increased at higher speeds to compensate for the speed itself, but that's not an issue. None of it is an issue, at least on paper. If I was put in charge of a Ratchet game, I'd bring back the formula from here, add the strafing from 2, and try to make momentum more core to the experience. But that's something which you could probably only do in a sequel. Indie developers know all too well the concept of feature creep, where you start out wanting to do a 2-hour little adventure game, and 5 years later, you've got more pages of dialogue than Skyrim. There is a time to add to your game, and that's when you're making the blueprint. Every additional idea you get during development should ideally be folded into the file titled sequel. Back to looking at Umbrus, the level ends in the Snagglebeast boss fight, which is where me and an uncle of mine took our first steps into game design. The fight has a lot of platforming integrated into it, with the boss's projectile attacks and the area layout, which gets more and more destroyed as the fight progresses, because you need to lure the boss on the bridges to dump it in the lava. But for some reason, the boss has a suck cannon attack where it spits out a tornado which drains all of your weapons ammo and then scatters it all across the map. This is the attack where we first started thinking as game designers, because we noticed that there was no way to find Rhino ammo in any level. It has to be bought. But the ammo still has a 3D model in the stores, so we began to think of how can we see it in the environments, and it clicked that if we could trigger the Snagglebeast's ammo dump tornado attack, it would need to empty out the Rhino, letting us pick that ammo back up. And it totally worked. Lesson 15. Theming. This is roughly the halfway point in the game, and after Quark's betrayal, Ratchet and Clank's relationship gets frayed, with the former no longer caring about saving the galaxy. Which is one reason why Battalia is such a great level. Ratchet and Clank's relationship is rocky, so we go to a war planet. And that theme plays up Ratchet's newfound disinterest in heroics in how the most hectic planet in the game so far is the first time he doesn't care about helping people. Also, this war planet theme makes for some incredible level design and enemy encounters. There's a scripted segment where a platform is blown up and we need to navigate on the beam it rested on. There's that bridge extension sequence which then has a tank right towards us, and there's the optional final push against the squadron holed up in the blown apart manor or castle or whatever that place is. If you value verticality and seamless integration of multiple environmental hurdles into an area, Battalia might have the best level design in the entire game. If you don't think too hard about the grind rail. Yeah. So, I love the grind rails, but I hate how they're very rarely themed. Ratchet 2 did this much better, where the Bolden grind section had us go across power lines and construction sites, and Planet Damacel's rail section took place on those monorail tracks. It doesn't ruin the experience when the grind sections aren't super interestingly themed or anything. It's more so that I just really like it when they get to that time to go the extra mile. And I'm sure the level designers also prefer to theme those better into the environments. But the grind rail section is really the only section here which isn't a home run. Check out the river flowing through the level and the little cliff areas. Check out how every enemy has a ranged attack, so combat gives you much less safe distance than in any prior level. Lesson 16. Payoffs. So, remember in Bloodborne, how the early portion of the game sets the player up for a werewolves and vampire story, and how the mid-game turns that expectation on its head? Yeah, they still did Castle Cainhurst to pay off those early game gothic horror expectations. Battalia is that for Ratchet & Clank 1. The next batch of levels will have every planet introduce a new gimmick to navigation which no other area then readily adopts, making the later half of the game's levels come across as vastly more individualized than the early game, where challenges were more homogenized. So Battalia kinda serves as the payoff to the game you've been playing so far. The reliance on gimmicks in the later half, I feel, underscores some of Ratchet & Clank's shortcomings which would be addressed in the sequels. The enemy standardization is not strayed away from past the mid-game. Enemies just kinda get harder, which kinda sucks because our options for dealing with enemies won't expand outside of some weapons unlocking. Ratchet 2's strafe ability really liberated the enemy designers because it locks Ratchet to the camera's angle of direction, and since you can activate it manually by holding down a button, that game lets you choose on the spot between two playstyles. Future games eventually went into the direction of crosshair aiming, which I hate, because the tight integration of platforming into combat requires that Ratchet would be maneuverable regardless of the camera angle, and being able to reorient him without moving the camera made things way more dynamic. I get that you only have so much controller real estate, so toggleable strafing might have been thought of as an unnecessary expense, but I think that control layout was the best thing about Ratchet 2 and 3, because it made up for the lack of momentum in the platforming by making Ratchet insanely maneuverable. Finishing Battaglia, I should note that it's where the Devastator rocket launcher unlocks. This will be important later. Battaglia is the final conventional Ratchet level. From this point on, expect gimmicks. Lesson 17. Gimmicks are far from inherently bad. When you throw a wrench into a game, a different sort of obstacle, you challenge the player to use the mechanics they've already mastered in an altered framework, which can allow for different aspects of the game to really shine. Gaspar and Orkson unlock from Battaglia, and Gaspar's gimmick is Ratchet needing to periodically use turrets to break down sealed doors. Orkson is much more expansive. This planet is too polluted for Ratchet to survive without the O2 mask, unlocked on Poketaru, so Orkson starts out as a Clank level. And the Clank path loops back to the ship twice, both times after obtaining a key item, which I think is very well considered. In case the player feels the need for some cooldown from playing as Clank, they have that option. And once you get to it, the Ratchet section is great. It's hard, and as I noted earlier, that's largely a byproduct of the actual terrain where we fight the enemies on being relatively small. And the gimmick of Orkson, when we're playing as Ratchet, is that the enemies are sleeping until woken up by the little blue gremlins. And you can sneak kill all of those to avoid almost every combat encounter on the main path. So, gimmicks. Gaspar gives us turrets, Orkson gives us an optional stealth challenge. The latter I think is more interesting, but both shake up what exactly an optimal path through a level is. But we're not done with these two planets just yet. Lesson 18. Optional should not excuse underdeveloped. Optional, tucked away content is not going to be done by anyone who isn't very on board with your game. So you are kinda screwing your diehard audience if you make those sections with less care than the mandatory stuff. And what do you know? Ratchet's optional sections are almost always toothier than the mandatory stuff. Gaspar has two optional sections. One where we destroy ships, another which is an insane lava gauntlet accessed by jumping into a volcano. The remake even made Gaspar land with an excellent killathon section. Ratchet and Clank Into the Nexus, which by the way is the best non-PlayStation 2 Ratchet game, took Ratchet 2's hovering gimmick and expanded airtime by multitudes and added charging stations. And that gimmick was reused in the remake's Gaspar. Those flying sections are so much fun, and I'd actually like to see Insomniac make a Ratchet game which is just that. As for Orkson, the optional paths are the trail to the Gold Bolt and the health upgrade vending machine. The Gold Bolt one I love because I discovered how to get to it while dicking around. I was just shooting ammo, wasting it, and my aforementioned uncle told me to stop wasting the ammo because we were saving up for the Rhino. Then a shot managed to blow open the back door and we figured out how to get the bolt. I was very smug about the whole thing. Not a fan of how the Visibomb gun is necessary to get it, but since it's optional, it's fine. The health upgrade is way more interesting to me. Ratchet & Clank 1 is hard, especially for a kids game, and the only way to increase health is by completing an optional and very understated section. You'd think they'd put this into the main path somewhere to ensure players know about it, but nah. Lesson 19. Appreciate the whole animal. This kinda ties into the talk of how gimmicks can change a player's conceptualization of the mechanics by having them applied to different sorts of challenges. Poketaru, the tropical theme island's gimmick, is escorting the resort owner around. He doesn't take damage, thank God, but we travel between islands on boats which have very limited terrain to fight on. These sections get hated on, but without moments like this, the close-ranged combat options would not be able to shine nearly as much. Poketaru concludes with the thruster pack upgrade and a dogfighting section, but like Gaspar and Orkson, I'd argue that the best parts of Poketaru are the optional ones. The interior level with those tilting platforms, and the tucked-away exterior path where we're killing the big pink brain monsters. Telepathopuses? These are great. Lots of fun. Know what isn't fun? Well, Lesson 20. Don't undermine your game. Planet Hoven is the obligatory snow level, and here's a sneaky little secret about the Ratchet & Clank franchise. It's impossible for it to have a bad snow level. Hoven's gimmick is slippery surfaces. Sadly though, this is relegated solely to the optional path, the superior path, the one which gets us the Raritanium. The paths for the Hydro Pack and the turret boss aren't bad. I actually quite like the verticality employed for both of them, but operationally they're pretty stock standard affair from what we've seen so far. What offends me, to my core, is the weapon which unlocks here. Little ball droids which hover around Ratchet and attack enemies that come too close. This is a training wheel weapon designed to mitigate the danger of enemy encounters. It should either have been placed way at the start or not be in the game at all. What is the point of giving the player a helping hand with the action platforming like this 2/3 of the way through the game? If anything, I feel this weapon pushes people into playing sloppier than they did before. Could be worse though, it could be the shield from Ratchet 2 and 3. But we can't end the Hoven talk on a negative. It's way too good of a level. I particularly love how there's a lot of winding in and out of caves, and how the Blargian pistol enemies are hiding in crates, like the frogs did on the Nebula station. The first helicopter, however, is not so good. Here's another example of the game undermining itself, I feel. I did not mind that the Visibomb gun was mandatory for getting the bolt on Orkson because it was optional. This enemy locks the level from opening up until he's been defeated, and the starting gear is not really up to the task. I got to him in my most recent playthrough with just a bomb glove, the flamethrower, and the suck cannon, and while I was able to cheese out a win against him, I get the sense that he was put in with the assumption that players would have obtained the Devastator. And I feel like the next level confirms as much. Gemlik Base over Old Tanis has energy towers which need to be destroyed to shut down laser gates. Great gimmick, but no free weapon is up to the task. There's no other point in the game where the player must purchase a weapon, so this design choice feels baffling to me because when the game is so stingy about actually doling out our currency that I played through the whole thing recently without buying anything but the Pyrocitor and the Devastator, and I collected every bolt I could find, I still wasn't able to buy the Rhino. It leaves a bitter taste to only have one weapon to be a mandatory purchase. And I think a better solution would be if either the General on Battalia had just given Ratchet the weapon when we landed there, or if there was an alternate way to unlock the barriers if you didn't have the Devastator or the Visibomb gun. The boss of this level is okay, pays off the dogfighting tutorial we got on Poketaru, and closes out the story on Quark quite nicely, unless you do the optional stuff on Old Tanis. But the real highlight of this level to me is actually the ships we face in the level itself. This is super nerdy, but humor me. They fire bombs at the player, and while they're firing, they're stationary. So your best time to attack them is when they're attacking you. But they don't attack you right away. Instead, the bombs are lined up to gradually make their way towards Ratchet, but don't have enough range to reach him right away. Each bomb shot closes the distance a bit more, so you're on the clock to take out the ship before it can take out you. The reason I like this enemy so much is because of how the encounter is directed simply by the ship's firing behavior. It's the same behavior as the bomb robots on Novalis had, but those didn't have enough of a health pool to make this sort of confrontation so engaging. Lesson 21, gameplay is not the thing in between the story, it is the story. After the Gemlik base level, we go down to planet Old Tanis itself, where we're met with a unique landing cutscene where lightning strikes Clank. The weather is too crazy for Clank to come out of the ship, so Ratchet must tackle things by himself. This is possibly my favorite level gimmick, because it really puts into perspective just how important Clank is to this relationship. We've got a long way to go before, like how movies abandon text screens, games abandon cutscenes, but moments like this I quite like. And even though it's done in a cutscene, I also like the encounter with Quark and how Clank isn't there for it. If the duo met Quark, I'd imagine we'd either get a speech from Clank, yuck, or he wouldn't realize it was Quark, like that "Quark had a sister" line from the third game. I like that it's just Ratchet, and how he's already humiliated Quark enough that he can walk away while Quark saddles into his sad new life as Steve, a McQuark. Strangely enough, considering how big a character Captain Quark is in the main story, the resolution to his and Ratchet's rivalry is optional. And like we've come to expect, the segment is great, but really only adds optional content. Yeah. Lesson 22. Deviate from the norm, don't replace it altogether. The path to Captain Quark is the most play the magnet boots get in a single section, possibly in any of these games? And it might actually be the least interactive part of any of these games. You can't use guns while on the magnet path in Ratchet 1, and you can't even jump. This path is broken up periodically with windy ice areas. The wind is horribly communicated to the player, but once you know about it, it's manageable. As for the ice itself, acts just like the ice on Hoenn did. It's slippery. If this was a mandatory path, I'd probably hate it because it's really hard and it's really not bringing out the strength of the game. But because it's optional, it's fine. I try it, maybe a couple of times, and if I don't succeed, I just bail on it until my next replay. Ultanis has a lot of that actually, because there's so much optional stuff here. But I really just want to talk about the chicken gun. Lesson 23, Scaled Strength with Skill. You might think that the chicken gun doesn't turn enemies into chickens, but it actually does. And here's the hottest take in the video, hot but true, it's the most skill-intensive gun in the entire game. It shoots out a beam, which transforms a hit enemy, provided the beam stays on the enemy for as long as it takes for them to turn, transforms the enemy into a chicken. Little grunts usually turn very quickly, but larger enemies take more time. If you screw up, however, and the beam breaks away from an enemy, you'll have to restart the transformation. A conventional gun just deals damage when its ammo hits the enemy. The chicken gun is an all-or-nothing deal, so the skill floor is quite high. But it's got infinite ammo, meaning you can use it endlessly, and since it's a beam weapon, it's much more lenient than most guns on exactly how tight the platforming must be. More so than maybe any other weapon in the game, your skill at the action platforming determines how strong this weapon really is. 10 out of 10 would put it in a sequel. And they did. If you want a more user-friendly version of the chicken gun though, Ultanis is also where the Tesla Claw unlocks. It's a beam weapon too, but it deals conventional damage. Think of it as a long-range pyrocitor. The Tesla Claw and the chicken gun are basically the same weapon, except the former is more forgiving, whereas the latter scales better with the player's own innate skill. The mandatory path on Ultanis themes the grind rail section as power cables, but other than that, there's not much going on outside of being clankless. Relearning the basics and readapting them for a much tougher level than any of the tutorial planets is a very good challenge. Strong gimmick. All in all, Ultanis is probably the strongest planet in the entire game. It has excellent optional content, its weapon unlocks are both great, the gimmick is unique, the theming strong, the NPC encounters are fun. What more can you say? A+. Next planet, however, I don't think passes the grade. The gimmick on Quartu is Giant Clank and the Hollow Guys. Both of these reverse the dynamic between Ratchet and Clank. Giant Clank is the purest distillation of the game's love of big things smashing into each other to go boom. The Hollow Guys makes Ratchet's sections as dry and removed from the core gameplay as Clank's sections were. We can't actually do that part when we first get here. We need to get the Hollow Guys by winning the hoverboard race on Callipo 3, but the section is some of the most miscalibrated design in the entire game, I feel. Etched out only with Drax's fleet. Disguising oneself as one of the enemies to have other enemies open barriers sounds fine on paper. The only problem is that it's not action, nor is it platforming. yet it's, for some reason, a huge mechanic in the endgame of an action platformer. The most interesting thing they do with this is having the player flip the disguise on and off during enemy patrol routes, but I feel like a more conventional sequence utilizing this time the enemy patrols gimmick would have been way more interesting. Thankfully, the conclusion to the Hollow Guys section makes up for the issues I have with it. Of course talking about the emotional reunion of Clank and his mother. Later games decided to retcon this and have him be the son of a magical timekeeper for some reason, but I prefer this. A hero can be anyone, you don't need magical parents or destiny. The area where we meet Clank's mother loops back to the ship via a slide, and since I haven't noted a lesson in a bit, let's make that Lesson 24, try not to waste the player's time. Every level in Ratchet, almost, loops back around to the start, so that there's not a lot of dead space between unlocking a new level and being able to go to it. Ratchet could overcome a lot of headaches if he had just landed his ship a bit higher, but let's not be nitpicky. You could argue that the meeting with Clank's mother is emotional enough that maybe it merited a bit of a walk afterwards just to let the emotion play a bit better, but Ratchet and Clank's level designers clearly had their priorities, and if standardizing this setup means one emotional moment is a 9 out of 10 instead of a 10 out of 10, that's easily a compromise I'll accept. Anti-lesson 1, you can always pace it better. So, I'm calling this an anti-lesson because this isn't really a design philosophy I think you'd benefit from beyond hindsight. In theory, yes, they could have made the moment play better, but that doesn't mean they should have gone back before launch and moved stuff around. This sounds a bit counterintuitive if you think this moment with Clank's mother deserved more time to breathe, but if you actually apply this thinking to more than this one section, you can break the game to pieces with suggestions on how to do it better. Like, why does the O2 mask unlock before the Hydro Pack? The O2 mask gives us endless lung capacity while swimming, and the Hydro Pack lets us swim faster. Here on Quartu, there's an optional swimming section with a great reward at the end, but because of how the Hydro Pack comes after the O2 mask, there was no way to create a really engaging swimming section until the last third or so of the game, meaning all of those sections are back-ended really hard. If the Hydro Pack had unlocked way before the O2 mask, there could have been some swimming sections where the gimmick was that Ratchet needed to constantly resurface for air. But because of the way the game paces these items out, this novel idea, which absolutely could have been done, just isn't. Is this a problem for the game as is? No. Could this have improved the game? Maybe. And that's why it's an anti-lesson. If you spend too long focusing on this sort of stuff, you'll never get anything done. Because there's always some way you could have paced things better. The next planet is Calibo 3. Lesson 25. Embrace glitches and oversights when they're good. Do you know why Devil May Cry has enemy juggling in its combat? That's because of a glitch which came up in Onimusha. There is an impulse to stamp out anything which strays from the creative's vision, but when something goes wrong, it can often be to a game's benefit. Case in point, Calibo 3, the Gadgetron planet. Gadgetron, for the uninitiated, is the megacorp, or ration, which runs things in the Solana galaxy. They make our gadgets, our guns, you get the idea. The intended level gimmick is periodically being locked in weapon test chambers, but the better gimmick was an oversight by the developers, which goes back to what I said about the towers on Gemlik Base, about how alternate progression layouts can be a strength. I also noted just a little bit ago how the finale of the levels tend to loop back to their opening areas. Because of this, there are many exploits to skip levels almost in their entirety, and the one on Calibo 3 is simply using the Visibomb to fly over a laser grid and flipping a hit-sensitive button from on to off. The idea is that you complete the level and flip it to get back to your ship, but the collision for the laser grid isn't tall enough to actually stop the Visibomb. Now, I'm pretty sure that this was just an oversight, but I think the game would have benefited from more moments like this. Lesson 26. Diegesis and Believability. Okay, so I'm kinda cheating picking Kalebo 3 for this lesson because it's such an apt concept to discuss here. The optional area here is a decently long grind rail section which ends with an in-universe meeting with the tutorial lady, the one who gives us tips throughout the game, which is a fun little integration of player convenience into the world design, making it feel that extra bit more real. They didn't have to do this, but they love us, so they did. They also didn't have to screw up the hoverboard track. Let's talk the single worst design decision in the entire game. Yeah, even worse than the Hollow Guys. So, the level ends on a new hoverboard racetrack. The race itself is fine, we get to use weapons this time around, so that's nice, but the actual racetrack itself is placed under the scenic water of the level. Now, it is not uncommon nor undesirable to load level chunks in the level out of sight, so that when the player wants to warp from one location to another, the game can do so without a loading screen. What is undesirable, however, is not hiding the level chunk. On Kalebo 3, you can see the entire racetrack from above, under the water, all throughout the level, and it looks so bad. If we want to be charitable, we can say that Gadgetron has the technology to manually raise and lower its water levels, and whenever a race is happening, they lower it to access the track, but no. The water texture should have been non-transparent and the track unseeable when not on it. Lesson 27. Don't solve a big problem with another big problem. I think what might have happened is that the water level might have always been intended to be where it is during the race, and then QA testers kept trying to hover down there, and the level designers decided to raise the water level to make sure players stayed on the intended path, and the game's immersion, think helipack-controlled descent, could be maintained. If so, and this is just a hypothesis, I don't know how this setup came to be, but if so, it's an example of solving a big problem with another big problem. Would have been fine, though, if the water wasn't see-through. The next level I'm also not a fan of, because conceptually this should have been the most satisfying one, but it's handled like Quar 2, with an extended Hollow Guy sequence. Lesson 28. Know how to say goodbye. Drax's fleet is where all of Chairman Drax, the game's main villain, where all of his cutscenes take place. In a very real sense, we've been building up to this level all throughout the game, so it kinda sucks that when we finally get to this place, we're sneaking around instead of tearing the place to shreds. I do like the optional swimming path and the mandatory dogfighting a lot, but if there was one level whose core gimmick should have been tear the thing to shreds, this one was it. Crates everywhere to give the player something to break, light posts and terminals which give you decent amounts of money, both to incentivize tearing them to shreds, but also to help the player grind since there's only one more level left. The Hollow Guys slows the pace of the level down to a crawl, and while you could argue that that serves a function to make an area more ambient, and to maybe make Ratchet feel more vulnerable, I'm not feeling it. I give them props for trying something different, but slow sections work best in the game as momentary detours from the action platforming. The final level won't have a Hollow Guy section, so thankfully the game concludes with the best it has to offer, but I'd be lying if I said the sections on Quar 2 and Drax's fleet don't rob the endgame of some momentum. Thankfully, Planet Veldin ratchets things back into the right gear. Who doesn't love it when the opening level and the final level are one and the same? People on registers, that's who. The first quarter, or third, of the level is the exact same as the opening area, and then it expands beyond the point where Ratchet picked up Clank in the beginning. The level to come employs the use of every gadget except the Hollow Guys, and while I don't think the level is necessarily standout in how it comes together or in its identity, it's definitely the most extreme challenge the game has to offer. Enemies are everywhere and tough as nails, and the final boss is the biggest spectacle in the entire thing. We first fight him as Giant Clank, which feels every bit as good as it should, but he reverts the change after a bit and we have to fight him for real as Ratchet. The fight takes place on various giant rock pillars, and his attacks largely act to create environmental hazards for us to look out for. When his health gets low enough, he breaks the pillars to shreds, so we have to get to another one, and man, can I say, it's a shame that the strafing mechanic turned the bosses in subsequent Ratchet games into low-key bullet hells, though that approach has some benefits. because these highly scripted platforming challenges are way better. Strafing is a great inclusion, but every boss after this game, with a couple of exceptions, just takes place in a circular arena, and the challenge is to strafe around them while timing your jumps correctly to avoid their attacks. This is why the secret boss in Usla in Ratchet 2 is the best boss in the franchise, by the way. It has the superior strafing combat in a game with the franchise's best arsenal, but the design of the level means doing side flips around the boss is not possible. You need to keep a certain distance, like you do in the Drak fight. The Drak fight concludes on the Deplanetizer, the device he uses to tear chunks off of planets so that he can construct a new one for his people. I forgot to mention the plot of this game is insane, and we have a grind rail section on it, as well as timed thruster pack button slams. There's also some AoE attacks to look out for, rockets, grunt enemies, the works. It's a really solid boss, and unless you've actually gotten good at the game, you're not beating him without buying the Rhino for about twice as much money as you'll probably be collecting in a single run of the game. It's like they always say, get good or get on the streets and start earning, yo. And it's like they also always say, know how to say goodbye. Lesson 29. And this is one channel regulars know by heart. Games excel at different things, and it's very rarely a good idea to ask a game to do something it isn't good at. The reason I decided to make this video is because I have been doing a bunch of level designing recently, and I wrote up a few rules to help me move things along the production pipeline. Then I randomly decided to replay Ratchet & Clank, and I was unable to not see the rules governing its design. Looping levels which minimize downtime, standardized enemy groups, interesting bottlenecks for progress, the works. If I would have paid more attention to this when I released Snail, that experimental game I did, probably I could have made it even better. And I will. Snail Director's Cut, confirmed. More on that in a future video. Back on Rack, if I had to pin down exactly what the strength of this game is, it's the action platforming set in a cynical, satirical world where the only earnest people are our heroes. Lesson 30. The game hits different people differently. But just because that's what I think the game excels at, others might disagree. Maybe you feel the game was strong in spite of its combat. Maybe it's the exploration aspect you prefer and would have wanted more of. Point is, ask 100 different people why a game is great, and you'll get about 100 different answers. That's not to say you can't please everyone with a sequel. Ratchet 2 is pretty excellent, but it's excellent precisely because it leans into the strengths of the first one. It did some things better, some things worse. I feel it kind of fumbled the energetic and chaotic world-building NPCs in favor of a larger main cast, something the third game did as well, but I also think it has superior combat and enemy encounters, which are better integrated into the levels, which are themselves more experimental than the ones here, in the first game. The Ratchet franchise was blessed with a foundation laid here, and I think it's telling about the quality that even though Insomniac has strayed away from certain aspects of Ratchet & Clank 1, 20 years later, they can mostly reuse this foundation, and it's still good. If you liked this video, you might be interested in checking out some other ones on the channel, like that one I did about the Resident Evil franchise and how it keeps presenting its iconic brand of horror even as the games evolved. Or maybe you'll like the 7-hour breakdown of Bloodborne I did, from beginning to end. Both are linked below. And of course, to stay updated on future videos, be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon while you're at it. I know no one likes to do that extra bit, but it's the only way you'll for sure get these notifications. If you want to watch an exclusive 31st lesson, which I couldn't place anywhere else in the video, be sure to check out the channel Patreon at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. Link below. There's also early access to videos there, so be sure to check it out. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.